Back at it again with the Moby Chapter 17, the Ramadan. So this chapter, to me, obviously uses religion to ask certain interesting questions about knowledge and truth and understanding. So we'll start out on the first page, where we have what I'll call a classic example of the lady doth protest too much. Okay, so let's read. I cherish the greatest respect towards everybody's religious obligations, never mind how comical, and could not find it in my heart to undervalue even a congregation of ants worshipping a toadstool, or those other creatures in certain parts of our earth who, with a degree of footmanism quite unprecedented in other planets, bow down before the torso of a deceased landed proprietor, merely on account of the inordinate possessions yet owned and rented in his name. So to me, even though Ishmael says he respects all worship and religion, this is a passage that clearly mocks and critiques the baselessness of much worship. A simple close reading will tell us that. First, the use of animal imagery of a congregation of ants, associating the ant, which is obviously conjures notions of insignificance, with the idea of a congregation and the absurdity of these ants, who are, of course, we tend to think of as stupid and not as sophisticated as a moral agent, still practicing a type of worship, lowers religion to a practice which is, capable of insects. And then second, the absurdity of feudal or restrictive class hierarchies based on money, and comparing these like materialistic power hierarchies to religion is not necessarily a flattering relationship. So even though this is a classic Melville trick, even though he starts by protesting that he will never make fun of something, he then immediately makes fun of it. It's a clever rhetorical trick and something that sets you up to maybe... It gives Melville the ability to pretend that he's not being as critical as he is, which in 1851 was probably an even more important hedge than it would be in 2020. So then we move to Queequeg and his practice of Ramadan, which is an interesting word, and it's probably the result of a little bit of imprecision, given that, Queequeg is theoretically from a Polynesian island, but I'm pretty sure in the middle of the 19th century, to the average Western European American, all kind of non-traditional Christian or Judaic belief was some form of, Islamism, or maybe they would make a distinction and say that something was a Hindu worship, but those are like the two words they would use and kind of group all other religions into those practices. So maybe historically it doesn't make sense that Queequeg would be Islamic or Muslim, but given that it's the middle of the 19th century, we forgive the imprecision. So in this yellow passage, Ishmael now moves away from the comical and gets a little more serious, and he says, all our arguing with him would not avail. Let him be, I say, and heaven have mercy on us all. Presbyterians, which are people who practice Anglican religion, and pagans alike, for we are all somehow dreadfully cracked about the head and sadly need mending. So it seems to me that obviously Ishmael positions the practice of religion as something which is a sign of poor thinking or understanding. Cracked about the head is obviously the detail I'd pick out there, and obviously the alliteration of Presbyterians and pagans, they start with the same letter to help him emphasize that they have the same kind of epistemic or personal understanding failure, whatever that is. And as we finish this chapter, we'll find out what perhaps we could say is Ishmael's critique of religion. Before we get there, we get a couple fun blue passages, which I love reading, right? Anytime we get blue, I'm happy. So first, after Ishmael has panicked about Queequeg's well-being in the room, he goes and gets a chambermaid and tells her what's happening, and the chambermaid runs off, la, la, ma'am, mistress, murder, Mrs. Hussey, apoplexy. And with these cries, she ran towards the kitchen, I following. Mrs. Hussey soon appeared, with a mustard pot in one hand and a vinegar cruet in the other, having just broken away from the occupation of attending to the castors. So the castors are like the little condiment trays that sit on restaurant tables. So I just find this passage very hilarious because the urgency of the situation has you expect for Mrs. Hussey to show up with weapons in hand, right? It's like she's being called to arms, right? Murder. But she has mustard and vinegar in both hands, like some kind of absurd kitchen warrior who goes into battle armed with condiments. I don't know. It's just funny to me. And then we have another blue passage I like, which I think everyone acknowledges is pretty funny. After the group concludes that Queequeg must have killed himself because his harpoon is missing, Mrs. Hussey says, has the poor lad a sister? Where's that girl? There, Betty, go to Snarls the painter and tell him to paint me a sign with no suicides permitted here and no smoking in the parlor. Might as well kill both birds at once. So to me, a sign for no suicides is inherently so macabre as to be funny, not to mention the utilitarianism of putting out a sign about no suicides next to a sign that says no smoking. There's a kind of callous pragmatism that we don't really associate with the discussion of something as serious as suicide, which is funny because it's absurd. It reverses our expectations. Okay, so here we have yellow 2 and yellow 3. Where we start to transition back to the idea of understanding and truth, specifically in the context of religion. And at first, Ishmael seems to practice a kind of tolerance or a kind of, attempted understanding of Queequeg's difference when he says, I wonder, thought I, if this can possibly be a part of his Ramadan. Do they fast on their hams that way in his native island? It must be so. Yes, it's a part of his creed, I suppose. Well then, let him rest, and he'll get up sooner or later, no doubt. He can't last forever, thank God, and his Ramadan only comes once a year, and I don't believe it's very punctual then. Okay, so this is your classic example of someone trying to, grow in tolerating a difference that he doesn't necessarily understand, right? This is a pretty positive passage about knowledge. It says that even if we don't understand something or humans don't understand something, as long as they practice a kind of moderated, reasonable understanding, things will get better. But of course that gets more difficult just a paragraph later when Ishmael says, I began to grow vexed with him, annoyed, if you're curious about that. It seemed so downright senseless and insane to be sitting there all day and half the night on his hams in a cold room, holding a piece of wood on his head. For heaven's sake, Queequeg, get up and shake yourself. Get up and have some supper. You'll starve. You'll kill yourself, Queequeg. But not a word did he reply. Given that we're reading Melville, I shouldn't have to ask too difficultly or too urgently for you to find a meaningful comparison in Melville's oeuvre to this particular scene. You should probably conjure the notion of Bartleby pretty quickly, right? There seems to be an impasse between Ishmael's understanding of why one would ever do what Queequeg is doing and Queequeg's commitment to that line of action. It seems to remind us of Bartleby in the sense that we're having a failure to communicate, as Cool Hand Luke would say. And I think another thing that associates this with Bartleby is that the concern for Queequeg here, just like the narrator's concern for Bartleby, starts out very earnestly, right? Like he's worried about Queequeg, and he's worried that this will be something that kills Queequeg, just like the narrator in Bartleby is worried about Bartleby's well-being. So we move on. And then we get to these orange passages, which I'm going to group together. This is after Queequeg finishes his fast and says that Ramadan is over. And now Ishmael just can't help himself, and he needs to express his opinions on the desirability or importance of this fasting tradition, which Ishmael clearly disagrees with. Thus we get these passages. Now, as I before hinted, I have no objection to any person's religion, be it what it may, so long as that person does not kill or insult any other person, because that other person don't believe it also. But when a man's religion becomes really frantic, when it is a positive torment to him, and in fine, makes this earth of ours an uncomfortable inn to lodge in, then I think it high time to take that individual aside and argue the point with him. All these Lents, Ramadans, and prolonged ham squattings in cold, cheerless rooms, according to Ishmael, were stark nonsense, bad for the health, useless for the soul, opposed, in short, to the obvious laws of hygiene and common sense. Besides, argued I, fasting makes the body cave in, hence the spirit caves in. And all thoughts born of a fast must necessarily be half-starved. This is the reason why most dyspeptic religionists cherish such melancholy notions about their hereafters. In one word, Queequeg said I, rather digressively, hell is an idea first born on an undigested apple dumpling, and since then perpetuated through the hereditary dyspepsias nurtured by Ramadans. So, a rather mocking passage where Ishmael seems to argue that anyone who believes these things has something wrong with them. And of course, what he says literally is what's wrong with them is that their stomach is upset, right? But two things. First, we can read that physical upsetness as a kind of mental or personal or spiritual upsetness, which I think he says rather explicitly, right? He says these are bad religious ideas. And secondly, the mocking tone and the absurdity of the apple dumpling seem to imply Ishmael's true distaste for the extremity of both Christian and pagan interpretations of religion, right? He seems to be arguing for a more moderated, more reasonable interpretation of religion than, the ascetic tradition that Queequeg is practicing. So, these are like Ishmael's thoughts, and he expresses them pretty well, and, it's pretty intense, it's pretty challenging, right? And so if this mode of engagement with religion were super effective, then obviously Queequeg, as the true believer in the religion which is being attacked, or the interpretation of religion which is being attacked, would have something to say in response, right? But I think what really ties the chapter into a bow is this final passage I've marked here. So even though we have that pretty scathing mockery of religion from Ishmael, how does that affect Queequeg? Well, after all, I do not think that my remarks about religion made much impression upon Queequeg, because in the first place he seemed somehow dull of hearing on that important subject, unless considered from his own point of view. And in the second place, he did not more than 1/3 understand me, couch my ideas simply as I would, and finally, he no doubt thought he knew a great deal more about the true religion than I did. He looked at me with a sort of, and I think this is an important phrase, condescending concern and compassion. As though he thought it a great pity that such a sensible young man should be so hopelessly lost to an evangelical pagan piety. And of course, what that last sentence does is it inverts the kind of relationship that we were observing before, where I think it's obvious that Ishmael had condescending concern and compassion for Queequeg and thought that he was lost to evangelical pagan piety. Whereas obviously from Queequeg's perspective, our boy Ishmael's failure to understand his religion is something that deserves concern and compassion. So the idea here that's raised, or the question that's raised, is how do you convince the true believer of any belief, be it religion or not? How do you convince the true believer to doubt their true belief? Let's say you're talking to someone who has a very extreme political view, or a very extreme religious view, or a very extreme personal view, like I hate pineapple on pizza. This seems to complicate the notion of reason and logic as modes of understanding other people. Perhaps not the universe. Perhaps you can investigate the universe logically. But to use reason and logic to understand other people seems complicated here, seeing as religion, and as I mentioned, there are other examples, are closed systems that seem very hard to penetrate from the outside. It seems to imply that our beliefs are as epistemically closed sometimes as our experiences are phenomenologically closed, right? Which I think that's why this is an interesting thing to bounce off of Bartleby, where this isn't necessarily about understanding Queequeg's internal experience. It's more about trying to penetrate into his reasoning or his thinking or his understanding of truth. But this passage kind of flips that on its head and says that project is, I don't know, I mean, I think this is a pretty negative passage about the possibility of engaging with other people in any reasonable or civil dialogue about their strong beliefs. It's not negative insofar as there are no consequences here, right? Like, they leave the inn, eating their chowder together and sauntering along and picking their teeth with halibut bones. So maybe we're to interpret the ending of the chapter as being, all's well that ends well. It's not a big deal that you can't use reason and logic to try to break down or attack or change someone's strong views. But nevertheless, it troubles me a little bit, I guess specifically as a debate teacher, that the notion of engaging with a reasonable dialogue about someone's strong views is so pessimistically treated in the chapter, but it is what it is. Okay, chapter 17 in the books. I will see you in chapter 18.